So good morning, everyone. It's a shame we can't meet in person during these difficult times, but hopefully we can try to do our best on Zoom. So yes, I'm a psychologist. I always feel like a bit of an intruder when it comes to cybersecurity events, but really my focus is on the human aspects and the people who are behind the hacking actions and the various things that take place. Within social psychology, there's a lot of research which is very relevant to hacking behaviour, although perhaps in the past it hasn't always really been utilised especially well. So I think psychologists, without wanting to make a sweeping generalisation, psychologists sometimes can be a bit scared of technology, and so there hasn't always been as much application as it could be. But there's a lot of things which are really relevant. So things like intergroup attribution, so how we explain the behaviour of other groups, and what you find in hacking communities is that people have very interesting perceptions of law enforcement, interesting perceptions of other hacking groups. There's a lot of competition between groups. We look at false consensus, and that's where people overestimate how much others in the group agree with them. And within a lot of hacking communities or hacking groups, when you see some extreme behaviour taking place, it's often due to the fact that the person who is kind of running that group thinks that everyone agrees with a course of action when actually they don't. We look at things like cognitive dissonance, so how people try to reconcile their behaviour with their belief system. If you look again at looking at cyber crime, cyber attacks, the language people use is really interesting. So people will use very kind of dehumanizing language when they're talking about a group they're going to target. We talk about leadership and hierarchies, and as a social psychologist, I also find it really funny. Lots of hacking groups say they don't have a hierarchy. They say there's no one in charge, and there absolutely is. When you look at the conversations, when you look at the interactions, there is someone in charge often. It's maybe in charge in a different way than you'll find in a traditional kind of offline group, but there's still hierarchy there. We look at things like category differentiation model. I'm going to give you an example of that in a second. But that's where just being identified as a group can actually reinforce that sense of being a group. And this is something you see in a lot of kind of more well-known hacking and hackers groups. We look at impression management, so how hackers and how groups try to frame themselves, how they try to make themselves look and sound very scary when quite often what we're threatening to do is beyond their actual ability. We look at subjective group dynamics model, which is a very long way of saying people really get a lot of their self-identity from the groups they belong to. And this seems to be especially the case in hacking groups. People really, the sense of who they are comes from being part of this group. And this is one of the reasons why we argue that if you're dealing with a young person, like in the 14, 15-year-olds, and they're getting involved in cybersecurity and they're maybe speaking to people online about hacking, it's actually really important not to try to take that away from them, because it's such an important part of who they see themselves to be. So rather than trying to take a very kind of draconian approach and be very kind of stern and strict, you try to guide people. You try to say to them, okay, it's great you're interested in cybersecurity, but there are safer ways of doing this. There's ways of exploring your passions. And also groupthink. So groups tend to make quite bad decisions, which is funny given how many committees we have at universities. But groups tend to make worse decisions than individuals do. And you get examples of this include things like the Challenger space shuttle disaster was attributed partly to groupthink. So if you have a hacking group, it's potential the case that they're going to make much riskier decisions than they would do, again, by themselves. And that could lead to things like criminalization. This is an example of what I mentioned. You may be familiar. This is the infamous Fox News report on the anonymous hacking or hacktivist collective. Also Fox News, always the voice of reason. We had a news report about Anonymous, where as part of a news report, we had this random video clip of a van exploding, which had nothing to do with hacking whatsoever. But there was this very kind of alarmist kind of reporting. And at the time, Anonymous, we weren't particularly well established, we weren't particularly powerful, we weren't particularly well known. But because we were on this Fox News report, the group actually got really kind of emboldened by this. You have someone external saying, oh, you're a really scary, powerful group. And so we think, oh, yeah, you're a really scary, powerful group. And so we started doing other things. And of course, being the internet, they almost immediately created a meme out of this image as well, the exploding van. So when we're talking about hacking, we're talking about hackers, we need to be really careful how we do that and how we kind of frame things and how we present this to the world, because we might be changing people's perception of themselves and also what kind of actions they then take. So our research has been looking at kind of hacking and hacking groups. I often get asked, how exactly do you go about doing that? How do you go about speaking to hackers? And my standard reply is always slowly and carefully. So we are always very open, very transparent about what we're doing. We We find people, I mean, I don't care how much someone thinks they're an anarchist and they're against mainstream society. People like to talk about themselves. If you can get them to trust you, they'll tell you a lot about, you know, what goes on in their lives. Our kind of rationale behind doing this is because, first of all, concern about young adults who become involved in hacking. After several years of research now, I can honestly say we've never met a single person who wanted to be a criminal. People get into it because they're interested and they're curious and they're passionate. But the problem is we don't always understand what we're doing, or we get kind of groomed into criminal behaviour. So we want to try to understand, well, why is this happening? How can we try to almost protect people from themselves? There's, of course, also a recruitment crisis in cybersecurity. And if you have young adults who are very passionate being criminalised at a young age, you then stop them from joining this industry. So you can try and solve both problems there at the same time. And there's just in general lack of research on what pathway does someone take, what determines if someone becomes a criminal or a cybersecurity professional. And there really isn't actually a great deal of understanding on that point. And again, just based on our research, there doesn't seem to be much that really differentiates those two things. It seems to be almost as much as what the person just happens to be exposed to, almost through luck, when they first start looking into this world. As one of our papers there, which kind of summarises most of what we've done to date. If you want to have a look, I think it's available for free, full text. If not, just email me. So what we've done, we've done several studies, but one of the ones that we talk about today, we looked at text from 4 online forums and 3 subreddits, which are focused on hacking. These forums and subreddits do change quite a lot. They're very fluid. They rise and fall in popularity. So you can, it's almost like a best guess. Obviously, these are surface level, you know, normal internet forums and subreddits. There are other mediums which exist, obviously, where you might get a more criminally focused chat. But what we were trying to do is kind of recreate what does a teenager encounter? If your 13-year-old starts Googling hacking, what do they find? We're trying to kind of follow that kind of pathway. We took a sample of threads, just, you know, kind of on threads that seem to be kind of relevant to the topic of hacking. It's amazing how much non-hacking discussion you get on hacking forums. So we chose threads that looked relevant. We have 120,000 words of text collected overall. And we did a more in-depth analysis on a subsample from each one using thematic analysis. For the kind of initial analysis of a big 120,000 word data set, we used something called LINQ, which is Linguistic Inquiry of Word Count. It's a software that looks at linguistic categories and kind of speech patterns or text patterns in a selection of text and tries to infer some psychological constructs from that. It's used to look at group dynamics and mostly kind of mental health topics. So people talking online about health or well-being or recovery from addiction. And the software has been used to try to understand what kind of interactions do you get. Obviously, when it comes to hacking, things might be a bit different because people are motivated to hide their identity. People are perhaps being cautious as to what we're saying. So we're kind of curious ourselves, actually, how well is this software going to work when we try looking at conversations on hacking forums. There's 4 things primarily this software measures. There's the degree of analytical thinking, so how kind of logical, formal are the kind of thought patterns you would expect without wanting to make stereotypes. And hacking and computing, you would expect people to be fairly logical in their approach. Clout is kind of how kind of confident someone is and the way they speak on these forums. So do they show kind of leadership, do they show social status, that kind of thing. Authenticity is a degree to which people are being honest. Now, obviously, this is all inferring. We don't know for sure if people are telling the truth or not. But people do speak in certain ways when they're being honest versus when they're trying to deceive someone. And the software looks at that kind of pattern of language. And also emotional tone. So how kind of positive the text is. If a score is below 50, it suggests a more negative emotional tone. So we're really curious. We think about some of the stereotypes around kind of hackers and hacking forums. We're really curious, what kind of things are we going to find when we apply this software to that text? We found it varied quite a lot. So for analytical thinking, on the first forum was actually quite low, which is quite surprising because you think hacking, computing is quite logical, it's quite analytical. It did vary quite a bit. Some forums, there wasn't really much evidence of particularly logical thinking taking place. Clout was relatively quite high across all of the sites, so people were speaking in very confident ways. And this is a bit of a concern. So I'm not a technical person. I always stress this to everyone. I can't fix your PC. I really don't have a kind of technical background. But even I could see sometimes on these discussion forums, people were saying things in a very confident way, which was just completely wrong. But you do get this a lot on these forums. It's very kind of very kind of confident, very kind of knowledgeable kind of way of speaking. And if you are a young person, if you don't really understand hacking, you can see why someone gets influenced really easily, because people we're speaking to just sound so sure of themselves. Authenticity, not particularly high, quite low in some forums, which again, not surprising. People are talking about potentially criminal activities or trying to hide their identity. But that's just funny that you get this kind of combination of people being very confident and presenting themselves as being very sure, at the same time, evidence about not being particularly honest about things. The tone was interesting. So there were a couple of forums and subreddits where the tone was fairly negative. So again, this is below 50, it means it's primarily a negative conversation. But I was actually quite surprised that it wasn't really that bad. When you look at some kind of hacking discussions, you get a lot of very kind of quite confrontational language people use. People tend to insult each other quite a lot. But actually, the tone really wasn't that particularly negative overall. And it's a really important point. It's one of the things, actually, if you look at the Fox News TV report, they talk about the fact that on these forums, people are very kind of aggressive and angry. But that doesn't necessarily mean people being negative. I mean, if you listen to especially teenage boys talking about, to each other, they can sound very insulting to each other, but it doesn't mean that they actually don't like each other. So it's really important when doing this kind of research to separate the actual use of words from the intent and understand that, people have different ways of communicating. What we then did was take a sample of each kind of thread and forum and did a more in-depth thematic analysis. This is where you kind of go through, text kind of line by line. We found 5 different themes overall. So there was a sense of skill acquisition was a really big thing. People spoke about learning how to do things. They spoke about tools that they would use. It was almost like a kind of a knowledge exchange system. People were kind of trading, information about things. People spoke a lot about learning, and it's funny really the amount of discussion around learning and understanding things and kind of progressing. It was much more extensive than you would find on a discussion page in lots of university courses. People who were really invested in learning the next thing. Again, though, we did find that there were some things were kind of inaccurate in there and some things were quite risky. Legality was a really big thing. People were talking a lot about, is this legal, is this okay to do? And there's a lot of uncertainty, which is not surprising because, as I'm sure you are aware, a lot of the legislation around hacking and computer use is just really out of date. So there's a lot of cases where actually no one really knows exactly, is this legal or not? And people were having discussions. But again, a lot of it was opinion. And there were cases we saw where someone was told something wasn't illegal when it was, or when they hadn't enough information given by a person for someone else to be able to say that isn't legal. Risk linked to that was a very, very big theme. People spoke a lot about risk. People spoke about how to mitigate risk, how do they minimize their chance of being arrested or detected. People sought advice from each other a lot as well. Honesty was an interesting one, and ideas of trust online. One of the things we found in one of our earlier studies was we would ask moderators in hacking forums, do you trust anyone? And they would laugh at us and say, of course I don't trust anyone online, that's ridiculous, why would I trust anyone? And then we'll say to them, but you've got people who help you moderate, you trust them? And you say, yes. Well, but you've just kind of slightly contradicted yourself there. So people do trust each other in these forums, and actually trust is actually necessary. And trust is almost more important when you're in a situation where what you're doing might be criminal. To be a good criminal, you actually need to be a fairly reliable, trustworthy person if you're working with other people. So there's a really interesting conflict between people very much acknowledging the fact that they knew people lie online and they lie during these forums, but at the same time having to kind of trust at least some of what's said. And that goes back to the idea of that cognitive dissonance, the belief versus the behavior. One of the big things we found was knowledge. Knowledge is basically currency on these forums. People share knowledge, and people talk about what's developing, what's going to happen, what threats are, what trends are. People give support to each other. It wasn't all particularly good support. It wasn't all particularly friendly support. People had to be able to demonstrate that they tried to find an answer themselves before they asked a question on these forums. But overall, looking at these forums, your initial impression isn't this is a load of criminals talking about how to hack. It was much more this is a learning community who are sharing information and sharing advice and kind of building up their status through those different things. So obviously there was criminal actions being discussed, but overall what stress was, what was really much more evident was that this was a learning community and the majority of people were trying to discourage criminal behaviour. And this is why I say so we shouldn't just kind of dismiss these kind of forums, try to kind of eradicate them or try to get people away from them. It's more about understanding kind of what's happening and what discussions are taking place. I've asked some quotes just to highlight some of the kind of points that were made. This person, as far as self-taught versus otherwise, the difference in this field is passion. People who are self-taught are aware because they have passion for it, and that leads to them becoming smart, successful. This has been a really recurrent theme we've found. People who are interested in hacking often talk about themselves as thinking differently. There's a lot of kind of people will self-diagnose themselves as being autistic or being on the autistic spectrum. And there's a lot of that. And actually, I mean, because you get companies like Microsoft, for example, have a kind of autistic spectrum hiring program just now. There's this perception of kind of autism and cognitive style. It's one of the things that we're doing some research on just now. And actually, our very, very initial findings is it's not particularly marked. So you do a slightly higher rate of what seems to be autistic spectrum disorder symptoms and people who are involved in hacking, but not to the extent that perhaps is the kind of stereotype within that community. And I wonder slightly people perhaps kind of slightly jump on the idea because we think it makes them sound kind of different and better. And there was a big thing for all of our research. People want to feel we are kind of slightly different from everyone else. This next quote, I've copied the grammar exactly. Being a lecturer, I wanted to correct the grammar, but this is exactly how it was written. If you didn't know when unhashing process stops, some pastors don't get recovered, so it wouldn't match every right password, you are such a noob. And we did get this quite a lot. This is quite a common thing. People would respond quite angrily to someone who it seemed hadn't done their homework or was asking a really easy question that we could find out through just Google. So it was a kind of learning support community, but it had one that quite a high bar. People had to kind of, it's almost like a point above. People had to prove they had passion, had to prove that they, wanted to be able to really learn this stuff. This is one of the risk, and Emily confirm, is it too risky now? I might take a break from it now. But again, people would give advice sometimes, which doesn't perhaps really the best advice. This is one that's kind of acknowledging this point, saying information can be biased or obtained incorrect, but of course not bashing everybody who teaches hacking. Some people, a very high percentage of people who don't know a dime about hacking. So it was acknowledging the fact there's a lot of bad advice given in these discussions. And interesting, because given the kind of negative reaction that script kiddies get, this person saying, well, I'm more technistic than I should be because actually it's you guys are going to make up the next cybersecurity professionals to take over the field. So there were a lot of kind of mixed opinions. It really wasn't, it wasn't a simple kind of community in terms of what people think. There were a lot of different ideas and thoughts. So from that, we found variation in language style and psychological processes used in different sites. So, I say the hacking community like it's one thing. It really isn't. There's a lot of different subgroups and sub-communities out there. Overall, discussion is characterized by a lot of confidence. People seem to be, very confident, seem to be trying to build their social status, but again, some of the advice given was quite bad. Knowledge and skill acquisition is a really big thing. People are motivated by the intellectual challenge of hacking. As I said, we didn't find anyone who wanted to be a criminal. They will want to solve a problem. They want to be, puzzle solvers. And that was a really strong motivation for them. There was awareness of illegality and risks. So, often in behavior change, what we try and do is tell people, if you do this thing, bad things could happen to you. So, like cigarette smoking, you get the picture of a diseased lungs. And that can play a role. It can be useful, but that by itself is not really going to bring around behavior change. So telling people who are involved in hacking, this is potentially illegal, most of them know that already. You've got to kind of go beyond that point if you're going to try to change behavior and try to prevent, especially younger kids, from getting involved in criminal activity. Opinions around grey hat hacking, so kind of a morality of do you access the system, do you exploit it, what do you do about it, were often subtle and complex. We didn't, again, we're looking in kind of in the hardcore criminal forums, but we didn't find anyone who wanted to be a black hat. We didn't find anyone who said they were a white hat. It was if you forgive a terrible joke, it was 50 shades of grey. It really was. People work somewhere between those 2 points and kind of varied in what we thought was acceptable. Okay, I think I'm coming up to time, so I think I'll be updating questions in a moment. But if you do ever want to collaborate or come and visit us in Bournemouth, you've got a lovely beach and travel restrictions allowing, we're always happy to have people visit us. Okay, I will stop there and I will stop sharing just so you can see me.
Okay, thank you, John, for the presentation. So while I don't see any immediate question on the chat, I can ask a few before people are trying to, right? So one thing that stand out was you did mention that some of the information there is mostly to discourage people from doing illegal things. Do you think this is because this is visible forums and they're more likely to be noticed by the police, or something like this or is it just a general consensus?
I think it's a combination. So people are aware that these are kind of easily accessible forums. But I think my feeling is that there's a genuine motivation behind not wanting young people to get involved in criminal behaviour. Not necessarily because the person advising them against it doesn't agree with that behaviour, but because they think the young person doesn't have the knowledge or the skills to be able to protect themselves. So the advice is almost, well, if you are going to do something criminal, do it properly. Don't kind of try doing this kind of thing you don't entirely understand. So, but yeah, I mean, the vast majority of posts, whenever someone would post something saying they plan to do something illegal, the majority of replies would be saying just don't do that because it's not worth it. It's not wise.
Okay, good. So I do have a question in the chat. Okay, thank you, John. Very interesting presentation. As you said, it is unknown why people go into legitimate cybersecurity industry versus an illegal one. I wonder, how do the LIWC scores vary for the discussion boards, discussion forums for the industry, for the security industry, sorry.
Okay, so the IRC, the relay chat ones. Yeah, so those used to be quite popular. So a lot of research on Sarah looks at anonymous because it's just one of the most documented ones. And they very much use IRC as a way of communicating. It seems to become less popular now. People seem to be gravitating more towards the kind of public forums almost. And obviously you will get to a point in those forums people do kind of go into a separate channel, and that's where it becomes hard to kind of follow. But we're trying to kind of follow what will the kid experience going through this process, and that tends to be initial stage tends to be the forums. The point about it not being easy to differentiate. To date, we've literally found nothing. We've found no reason. People in cybersecurity get something a bit insulted when I say this. We found nothing that differentiates someone going into cybersecurity career versus becoming a criminal, and it does just feel like it's kind of what they get exposed to early on that pushes them towards one direction.
Okay, thank you. Another question which I found very relevant, you talked about trust and honesty, right? So it's very easy for people to write information online. And one thing that you did say is people don't trust, but implicitly they do trust something. So do they do some validation? Do they do trust by reputation, or?
Yeah, so people will tell us we don't trust anyone, but we do, and you kind of have to. You can't really function as a human unless you have some kind of trust relationship, and we are geared towards trusting people that we think we know. So you know, we have internet these days. We have internet relay chat, and we have forums. Our brains are still the same as they were 20,000 years ago. If you know someone, you're kind of driven towards trusting them, because we aren't really used to kind of the idea that the person we're speaking to might not be a person who we actually think they are. So there's definitely a trust relationship there, where people kind of struggle with it. In terms of validation, it's difficult. I think this could be a reason, actually, could be a reason why there's a movement towards discussions on forums as opposed to chat channels. Because if you're on the forum, it's much easier to check what someone said previously. You can kind of like see, are they being consistent in all the threads for the last year or so? Whereas on chat, people can, it's easy just kind of change it, kind of claim who you say you are or where you live. So some validation, but not that much. Given, especially when it comes to kind of criminal discussions, given the risk involved, it's actually amazing how little knowledge people actually have about each other sometimes, and yet they agree to do some kind of criminal activity together.
Okay. So we do have time. I do have one final question, which was actually,
I think there's a question in the Zoom chat as well.
I think that's the question that I just read.
Was that one you just asked, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yes, yeah.
Okay, so the first question that I had was when you talked about the hierarchical model, saying there's somehow a leader in the group. Is there any difference between hacking communities or just regular groups? Because I would imagine a regular group, you always refer to the one with senior experience because you don't know how to do things.
Yes.
Does it work somewhat similar, or?
Yes, and it's amazing how similar it is. And we look at these groups, they tell you we have no hierarchy, we're all equal, and we're just not. There's always a leader, there's always someone in charge. And it's primarily based on knowledge. Whoever appears to have the most knowledge becomes leader. I do say appears to, because there's cases where a person is exaggerating how much knowledge they have. But in some ways, you could say that the leadership within these groups is actually better than in kind of business leadership, because in businesses or universities, the person in charge might not have the most knowledge. They just have been there the longest, so they become the kind of the leader. Whereas in these groups, it does seem that people have to kind of prove themselves fairly regularly. So it's definitely, it's kind of knowledge and ability is what drives someone to that kind of position.
So probably one final question, because we run out of time. You say that the person in charge has to prove themselves. Do you think this would lead to riskier behavior? Because if every time they have to get revalidation from the group, they're more likely to do things that are more riskier, that will attract attention.
Oh, totally, yeah. So people kind of have to prove themselves. They have to go to the next biggest hack, and so definitely and because people in these forums do come across as being very, very confident. If a leader is very confident, saying, "Well, we can do this," and we aren't going to get caught, the group are likely to go along with that. And there's been cases where the leader has kind of has done this. We've been caught. The leader has then blamed the less experienced members of the group. So he's going to use them in a kind of scapegoating way. So yeah, absolutely, it can be a really big problem.